Hi, everyone. I'm just here to announce that the AAA conference begins tomorrow. It's going to be the 16th through the 18th. It's free to all the events are free to all Harvard students. And me and a couple other people are going to be handing out detailed schedules at the end of class. So if you're interested, please pick one up. Thanks.
The Confucian Golden Rule, which is simply stated in the negative, do not do unto others what you would not want others to do unto you, is considered a minimum requirement for peaceful coexistence of a complex, diverse modern society. Since the statement is stated in the negative, it has to be augmented by a positive statement. The positive statement is wishing to establish myself. I help others to establish themselves. Wishing to enlarge myself, I help others to enlarge themselves. The negative statement is to provide a condition where non-conflictual, peaceful coexistence is possible. It's predicated on the belief that that which may be the best for me is not necessarily the best for my neighbor. It doesn't mean what my neighbor does or what my neighbor believes in is not at all relevant to me. It is profoundly meaningful to me. Therefore, it is important for me to understand that my self-establishment, self-transformation, self-realization, self-enlargement is predicated on my ability to help others to do likewise. The idea of an isolated self is profoundly meaningful, especially in Western philosophy. It's important for many Chinese philosophers as well, but profoundly meaningful for Western philosophy. David Hume, for example, noted when he was in his own study, in the attic, in his own study, he was often bothered by the question whether there are other minds. I know I have a mind, but I'm not sure there are other minds around. I know I exist, but I'm not sure whether other people exist, or even the outside world exists. It may sound silly to us in our commonsensical idea of ourselves, but for philosophers, these are profoundly meaningful questions. The question of the other minds, the question of the outside world. In fact, modern Western philosophy began with a very critical reflection by Descartes when he asked the following question, again in a very simple-minded fashion. My interpretation of it is simple-minded. The whole philosophical enterprise itself is immensely complex. He asked the following question that we may have doubts about everything, about the outside world, about other minds, about even the existence of other beings, but we are absolutely certain about the doubting self, the self that is capable of doubting. When I think about it, that thinking self is taken for granted. And therefore, the self, as the mind thinking about itself, is irreducible. In a sense, it is a primary datum for any kind of philosophical reflection. But as Hume pointed out, he was deeply bothered by those questions about the other minds, about the existence of the outside world, when he was alone in his private study, maybe sitting in an armchair trying to reflect upon those kind of issues. But when he left the home, left his home, left his study, and went to a pub, and entered into a conversation, share a drink with someone, and those questions became not very important. He was no longer bothered by those questions. But he mentioned that in passing. He was not serious about that. He was much more serious about the thinking mind reflecting upon some of the major philosophical issues. But from the Confucian point of view, his anecdote about going to a pub, engaging in a conversation, those questions became not very important, is extremely revealing and important. Because the ordinary way of living is self in communication. The ordinary way of living is not self in isolation. But the challenge from the Confucian point of view of self in communication is immense. To how to live the ordinary life is not at all easy. Confucius is quoted to have made the following statement. Of course, he made that statement with profound sense of regret. He said, I understand every cultivated person ought to be able to do the following things. And unfortunately, I'm not able to do. To serve my father as I would expect my son to serve me, that I cannot do. To serve my ruler as I would expect my ministers to serve me, that I cannot do. To serve my older brother as I would expect my younger brother to serve me, that I cannot do. To serve my friends as I would expect them to serve me, that I cannot do. We can extend that to serve my wife as I would expect my wife to serve me, or to serve my teachers as I would expect my students to serve me. That cannot be done. In the sense that the dyadic relationship of mutuality is something either when we do it, it becomes excessive or become deficient. It is not just right, because it is almost impossible for any of us to control the total situation. I think Descartes was trying to find something which is not only irreducible, which is so certain that we don't have to question about it. The doubting self, when I think, therefore I am, the doubting self is something I can totally rely upon with no external conditions imposed. Once you take the other, no matter what the other is, as significant, then you're in trouble. In the sense, there are conditions beyond your control. Since there are conditions beyond your control, you have to negotiate, have to discuss, have to discover, and have to encounter the unknown. Now, despite the importance of dyadic relationships, I just pointed out, in fact, the basic 5 relationships in the Confucian tradition, but many others, between parent and child, ruler, minister, siblings, younger, older siblings, friends, husband and wife, and of course, by implications, friend, teacher, disciple, client, patron, all kinds of other relationships. Despite the importance of all these dyadic relationships, the autonomy, independence, and dignity of myself as a person are critical for my own sense of my worth. This is the reason in Western mode of thinking, the idea of privacy, that domain that I consider to be my own, that should not be invaded, even by my close relatives, let alone by society or by nation. But the sense of a particular domain that I can call my own, my privacy, that is to be protected, hopefully by a legal framework, even though extremely important in the West, is a highly complicated issue. For example, the distinction between private and public in our ordinary language. We call the market as private, the government as public. We call our institution as private. some other institutions as public. But from the Confucian perspective, the private and public could always be understood in terms of both the creative and destructive tension. How to incorporate structures of otherness into our own personal knowledge, or you can say into our own private sphere, is critically important. How to extend our private sphere that will be able to incorporate continuously many areas that we normally call the other is a process of self-learning. Now, to make it simple, we can actually imagine the self as private vis-a-vis one's family. So I can say my private self and the family is public. Parent-child relationship, sibling relationship, and so forth. Try to broaden myself in order to incorporate close members of the family. It is to move from the private to the public. The family is private vis-a-vis a larger social order like the village or the clan organization. So the family, especially the nuclear family, can be private, but the larger family and extended family is public. So how to move from the feelings of interconnectedness with one's family members to a much larger set of relationship is to move from the private to the public. You can say the clan organization is private vis-a-vis the community. The community is private vis-a-vis the society at large. The society at large is private vis-a-vis the nation. Then you can say the nation is private vis-a-vis the world. We have our private American interests as opposed to the interests of the international community. And you have to further extend from the Confucian point of view that the world, the human species, the world is private vis-a-vis the cosmos. That humans can actually deeply concern about their private interests at the expense of the ecology. Eventually, our private interest will not be able to be maintained as well. In the 1970s, when I was teaching at Berkeley, I heard the idea of a group of philosophers. They call themselves lifeboat philosophers. In the 70s, immediately, the idea of the lifeboat evoked in my memory the Earth, from the perspective of the astronaut, the Earth as the lifeboat. That's our public domain. When I went to visit this group of people, actually in Santa Barbara, they were very surprised that I took the lifeboat as the Earth because they consider their lifeboat as Santa Barbara, which is an area in California, and they wanted to protect the interest of Santa Barbara at expense, if necessary, of the state of California, let alone the world and beyond. In other words, they're thinking locally and acting locally as a philosophical orientation. I was quite surprised by that. And suddenly I realized the whole notion about self-interest, no matter how broadly defined, is always a private domain. You can even say the self-interest of the nation, the self-interest of the world. One thing to remember in this connection is that what are some of those feelings or ideas that are profoundly personal, but not necessarily private? This is what the Confucians are particularly interested in. Some profoundly personal feelings, but they're not private. They can be publicly debated, argued. They can also be publicly accountable. The kind of strong feelings that I cherish, that I think they're not simply private feelings, they ought to be shared by others as well. That sense of the person in communication is linked to a conception of the community not simply as the other. the community is actually more than the sum total of its individual members. The community is not simply consist of individuals. Some scholars use the expression collective consciousness, a sociologist, for example. But that notion of collective consciousness is also linked to the idea of collective conscience, because the sociologists happen to be French. In French, the word conscience, which is spelled as our conscience, means both consciousness and conscience. There's no distinction in French between consciousness and conscience. Consciousness is a form of awareness. Conscience, almost like the soul of the community. It's latent with the basic values. Any society is more than simply the combination of the individual members, because society necessarily embodies something which is intangible. That's the collective consciousness or conscience. And that collective consciousness, as many scholars have noted, not just sociologists, but even political scientists now, is based upon certain idea of trust. It's not possible to have any community if that ingredient of trust is totally absent. Now, take our own community into consideration. Harvard University is the oldest corporation in the world. The word corporation was first used by Harvard University, now, of course, used by everybody, many private corporations. So when Harvard came into being as a corporation, the original idea was to train a group of well-informed Christian leaders, missionaries, that were able to spread the gospel. That notion of cooperation is very general in terms of the formation of any community. It's not a blind faith in the correctness of the collective goal of that cooperation if you become a member. But there is a measure of trust. If trust is absent, no cooperation, especially educational cooperation, is able to survive. And so in this sense, our personal identity is always shaped by the various kinds of affiliations. Not only a university, but even your house, your own roots in terms of your own community, various kinds of voluntary associations you join. You don't lose yourself, but your self-understanding and your public image is being shaped by many of these relationships. In this sense, institutions are not simply the physical infrastructures based upon some kind of financial arrangements or power relationships. Of course, all these are important. But all kinds of institutions are also styles of human relatedness. No institution can be totally devoid from a certain kind of human factor of human relatedness. Self-definition, in this sense, is linked to a set of human relatedness which defines who we are. And in so doing, that no institution is devoid of some embedded values, the basic values. Now, if you take a simple example, like my personal example, how do I define myself primarily as someone who's function in the Confucian world? Common sense tells us that a person is inevitably embedded in a network of relations. Since we are particularly sensitive to race and sex nowadays, we're likely to notice signs of ethnic consciousness and gender construction. But we must also remember that a concrete living person is essential relationships. So I am my parents' son, my children's father, my wife's husband, my older brothers, in Chinese called Xiong, his younger brother, and my younger brothers and younger sisters' older brother, my aunt's nephew, my older brother's senior uncle, and my younger sister's daughter's maternal uncle. Each of these terms is very meaningful to me in terms of my self-understanding. As essential relationships, I'm embedded in a very richly textured web of human interaction or human interchange. Even if I sometimes involve in my own philosophical mode and physically totally alone, I'm emotionally constantly intertwined with a dynamic interchange, which defines and redefines my own life world. And that life world, as I understand it, is a flowing stream. You may ask the same kind of questions. Normally, we do not answer the question, say, well, I am an individual that bears some inalienable rights, or I am an individual motivated by certain rational choice to maximize my self-interest in the marketplace. Normally, when you ask yourself, you either link yourself with a land, with a person, with a background, with a history, with an ethnic group, with a certain social political events. So that sense of the self in communication, in relationship, is commonsensical. And I think nowadays, philosophers, even in the West, begin to become very critical of Descartes' idea of the thinking person or the thinking mind as the only irreducible reality of human existence. They begin to question whether that clear separation between the mind and body is really that truthful, that meaningful, that efficacious in forming social communities. This sense of interconnectedness is linked to an idea which becomes quite central to Confucian discourse. You will encounter it time and time again, the question of reciprocity. I want to introduce two Chinese words, just two Chinese characters, to give you a sense, not to obscure the whole discussion, but to give you an indication of how the Confucian thinkers reflect upon this issue. The first character is called Zhong, over here, often rendered as loyalty. But if you look at the characters, this actually is a symbol of the heart and mind. In Chinese, heart and mind are interconnected. You don't have a word for heart and another word for mind. So often, the word xin is rendered as heart and mind. This word actually means the center. So the centered heart is zhong, the heart that is centered, which means when we say honest to yourself is to allow your heart, which is both emotional and cognitive, centered. So the heart in your own body, notion of zhong. Another word using the same radical heart as the base, but another word, ru, which actually means like, or as. So to try to think about the other person as if you're thinking about your own heart, which means, of course, sympathy. To use your heart as a measure to think about the heart of someone else. In other words, a heart-to-heart conversation, right? So the center of your heart and the ability to think about some other person's from the primary datum of your own heart, the center of your heart is called honesty toward yourself. To think about someone else in terms of your own heart is considerateness towards others. The structure, the thinking structure, is the relationship between internal and external, between the root and branch, between what is substance, what is substantial, what is basic, and what is its actual function. Also, between the self and other. So the self is the inner core of one's own understanding, and the other is the application of your understanding in a dialogical relationship. In other words, if you do not understand someone else, especially those who are very close to you, there's some deficiency in terms of your own self-understanding. Obviously, the emphasis is on feeling, not on rational calculation, not on the deliberate rational calculation, how can I do this in order to inference that? But simply to say, is my feeling in the right place when I interact with other human beings? Now, normally, in Western styles of moral reasoning, the most important feature is reasoning, is rationality. Therefore, even this course is characterized in moral reasoning. Recently, we even talk about emotional intelligence. The word is intelligence. You have to be intelligent about your emotion. But the human condition, as Robert Bellah, who is a sociologist at Berkeley, has defined, I think it's very useful. The human condition, again, based upon our common sense, is there's always an affective surplus and a cognitive deficit. The affective, meaning emotional, the human situation is there's always an emotional overflow and a cognitive or intellectual deficiency. No matter how much we know, our desire to know more, we may be able to control our knowing in terms of knowledge. Often we cannot control the emotional implications. So the emotion, the desire to learn more, always goes beyond our actual intellectual capacity to know. The old Enlightenment image is that as the light extends, darkness recedes. So the more we know, the more we'll be able to have a better appreciation of our universe. If we know comprehensively, there's no ignorance, there's no dark corners in terms of our universe. Let's assume that our universe is like this auditorium. If the light source continues to shine consistently for a period of time, we see all the furniture in this room. We know exactly where we stand. We know exactly what the situation is. This is the great ambition of the Enlightenment. Unfortunately, the more we know, the more we are aware of the fact, as knowledge extends, ignorance extends further, much further, and even faster. So the more we know, the more we become aware of what we do not know, no matter whether we penetrate very deeply into the tiny particles or broaden our scope to look at the cosmos. So that is obvious. This is common sense. It's not anything extraordinary. So then the reasoning power itself, in many arenas, is very deficient, very weak. Therefore, to privilege feeling is important for the Confucian style of moral reasoning. Even for our own sake, it's important to understand. Therefore, the golden rule in this connection is predicated on the importance of sympathy and empathy. Sympathy and empathy are more important than our reasoning power. If we cannot reason well, the Confucians say, well, that can be improved. But if our heart is not at the right place and our sense of considerateness cannot be extended, it is a major flaw, not just a character flaw, a major flaw in terms of our own self-understanding. The assumption is this, that any human community based upon trust actually exhibits, we cannot know it, exhibits certain kind of internal resonances, almost like music. I think this is a nice hall to talk about this. The music, the kind of symphonic structure, the music is different kind of instruments will play some tune and they form into a highly complex interconnectedness in terms of internal resonances. So if the voice truly coming from the heart should have sympathetic resonances with other hearts. No community can survive if there's no internal resonances. If the society is only formed by self-interests, everybody is very calculative, everybody knows exactly the rights with no sense of give and take, and then the society becomes simply a legalistic structure of arranging something. It's not a corporation, it's not a company, it's not at all a fiduciary, meaning trust, fiduciary community. Of course, from the Confucian point of view, we're not going to get into this particular issue now. The internal resonances are not just within the community, between the self and the community, but also between communities and between human species and nature, and even between human heart and heaven. These are some of the issues we'll be able to explore later. But empathy, of course, means the ability. This ability is not simply imagined. The true ability based upon your own feeling, enter into the existential situation of someone else. You truly understand, not yourself alone, but what the other person really wants. The only way we can do that is by analogy, not by any kind of simple deductive logic. Analogy means that we use our own body as a measure. How would I feel if I were in his or her situation? It's a simple question. But often we do not feel much if the person is not connected with us, if we become angry, if we're totally self-absorbed, if we believe that anything that is not connected with my self-interest is not worth the trouble. Now, some people believe this is a kind of a sensitivity training, training someone to be very sensitive. But it's not sensitivity training at all. It would not work if it is simply you go through a training program and you're programmed to become sensitive. And after a while, you're so well programmed, your sensitivity is a blatant demonstration of a form of insensitivity because you become numb. You become programmed to react in a certain way which is totally ritualistic. This has to be growing, has to be something that you cultivate naturally as a glowing stream. It's not a form of psychological technology, because if it becomes a psychological technology, it can become extremely manipulative. Eventually, it will be self-defeating. Analogy, in this sense, is based upon the person who is situated. In other words, we have to understand our own situation, our own ground, or ground of existence, or our own root. That understanding of our own root, of our own ground, and our own situatedness is to center the heart. That is the meaning of being honest to myself. But that centered heart is not simply an inertia. Certainly, it's not just confined to a particular domain. It is always a dynamic process. Heart, as the body, is always in the process of transformation. Now, that transformation often gives us a sense of restlessness. No, we don't know where that is. But in order to link meaningfully to many others through the dyadic relationships, we have to overcome its inertia and habitual forms of doing things. So we have to imagine this is not something which is pre-programmed. If we believe we need to be pre-programmed to become human, I think it's very lamentable. That's the reason why a person should always be understood as an end in itself rather than as a means to an end. We can be easily programmed by society, by our parents, by our peer groups, by all kinds of forces from outside. So the primary concern in this connection is first to be able to center our own heart, to be able to be in charge of our own feelings. Now, Peter Berger was a sociologist at Boston University. Once in a dialogue with him, he argues a very important feature in liberal democratic thinking is that the sense of alienation from society is important for our freedom. If there's no alienation, there's no freedom. You have to feel somehow alienated before you can fully develop a sense of responsibility for yourself as a free agent. That, of course, is a major challenge to me. From the Confucian point of view, society or community based upon trust is the environment through which we can fully realize ourselves. But now I can see his point. There's always tension. There's always conflict. There's always what we call otherness that we cannot control. If we only believe in ourselves, our doubting self, our thinking mind, we don't have to worry about these things. Once we want to enter into communication, even with people that we truly trust, there is a risk. Therefore, a sense of alienation is inevitable when we want to enter into communication. But that alienation can be overcome, can become a creative tension rather than a destructive tension. The political scientist Lu Xunpai has recognized that in all Asian societies, there's a great deal of dependency need, according to his sociological and political studies. The societies in Asian societies, mean East Asia, Japan, Korea, Taiwan, the People's Republic of China, and so forth, there's a much longer period of dependency of the young. Whereas in American society, there's a great deal of emphasis on independence. Once you enter into college, you should become independent. Hopefully you will financially be independent, everything be independent. But in Asian societies, so long as you're not married, you can always be a dependent. You may not get married at the age of 30, so it's okay. So you still stay at home. That's quite common. This whole notion of dependency, allowing the person to grow slowly over a long period of time, has been criticized by Lu Xunpai and others as dependency need, therefore difficult for the development of an independent individual to take charge of your own responsibilities. But I think another way of looking at it is that the process of growing up, especially for humans, as compared to other members of the animal kingdom, is a long, painful, and difficult process of growing up alone. The dependency need then is fully human. It is human to be dependent. We observe that it takes a newborn baby at least 3 years to be able even to walk around. The need for the maternal care for the young, as compared to any other animal for the humans, is much longer. That's the reason why the Confucians argue that when we pay our tribute to our parents, we should remember that they took pains for at least 3, maybe 10 or 15 years, try to take care of us. A very dramatic example of this is Erik Erikson's study, who's a very important psychoanalyst. The study of the situation in the concentration camps about children under 6. Many of them die not because of malnutrition. In fact, they were basically fine. The only reason they die, according to this kind of study, was because they were alone. Now, the study shows that the need for children to see, to be seen, to speak, to be heard, to touch, and to be touched is sheerly for human survival. For solitary confinement, for children below 6, sometimes even as old as 8, just solitary confinement, food is always there, there's enough exercise, nutrition, but there's no communication. The kid always dies over a period of time. When you see and there's no response, your stare is not responded by any other kind of eyes. When you speak, there's no other voice from the other side, and you're not being touched, not being hugged. Why Some people, like in China, during the Cultural Revolution, people survived 10 or 15 years in solitary confinement. These people survived because they were adults, and the reason they survived because they had the memory of being in communication. The memory of being touched, the memory of being seen, the memory of being heard. Without that memory, there's no way one can survive. So dependency in this case, especially mutual dependency, you can even say between the self and a community, no matter how that community is defined, as a family or as a neighborhood and so forth. Let me quickly bring this to close. I would like to have some time for questions. The peaceful coexistence as a minimum condition for human survival ought to be predicated on the principle of do not do to others what you would not want others to do to you. Since in terms of human communication, this is not simply the zero-sum game. No, zero-sum game as calculated in terms of economic interest or political power is that if I get more, then you'll get less. But in terms of human interaction, especially in terms of cultural interchange, both sides will become enriched. So the peaceful coexistence as a minimum requirement is not enough. We have to go beyond that, beyond the zero-sum game. And that requires a commitment to a common goal, to consider the non-exclusive style of human flourishing as a joint venture. The ideal joint venture, not in economic sense, but in a cultural and spiritual sense. You can say that one great Confucian ideal is to create an environment in which human flourishing is a joint venture. Joint venture of all the individuals involved, all the institutions involved. So all the rationale for the existence of a government, for social structure, is to provide opportunity for human flourishing. In this sense, then, in a pluralistic society, there are many, many faith communities. The best way out, again, it's highly idealistic, the best way out is to make each of these faith community a reference point or a reference society for mutual elucidation. That's the reason why I think the dialogical mode is important. It's not the clash of civilizations, but the dialogue of civilizations. Because each faith community, from my limited, say, Confucian point of view, each community can provide a standard of inspiration for me. If they're Christians who lived a very meaningful Christian life as a form of human flourishing, for me, as a non-Christian, it's a standard of inspiration. That's true with the Muslim community or with the Hindu community. And yet, when I judge that community, I don't judge that community in terms of the metaphysical assumptions, but in terms of the actual ethical behavior. Peaceful coexistence, beyond the zero-sum game, commitment to a common goal, and joint venture for human flourishing. Now, while we celebrate cultural diversity, we must try to put a great deal of emphasis on the cultivation of shareable values. The more we celebrate diversity, the more we should be attentive to the necessity of shareable values. Because if diversity leads to what we call pernicious relativism is I really don't care. These people, I cannot really meaningfully deal with them. Just let them do anything they see fit. No communication. That decision, in fact, undermines one's own ability as a person who is an open system rather than simply closed ego. Finally, if we take human beings as living persons, we need to look at each and every human being, including ourselves, as in communication, therefore, as in a richly textured relationship. Very richly textured, and it becomes richer and richer. The more we enter into communication with others, the richer our form of life will be. And that is a continuous process. And we do not learn to appreciate others simply through a kind of programmed social skills. This is not social skills. This is not even altruism. And I want to be nice to others, to be considerate to others. This is not even altruism, because it is inherent in the project of my own learning to be human. It is learning to be a learning for the sake of the self. It is not learning for the sake of others. And yet, paradoxically, the other is very critical for my own learning. If the others do not respond to my own feelings and ideas, I know there's something basically wrong with my own feelings. Maybe a couple of questions from the balcony or from the back as well. Acoustic is fine, so if you can ask a question loudly, we should be able to hear you. Any questions from the back? Or yes, please. I don't know whether I understand your question. The idea of do not do unto others what you would not want others to do to you. Right. Right. I think you pointed out a very important limitation of the Confucian tradition. I think what you're talking about is what we call radical otherness. Something that's so radically different. How are you going to relate to that? Now, Clifford Geertz, an anthropologist, have stated this is the modern consciousness. He calls it the liberating experience of confronting something radically different. If you're confronted with a classificatory scheme which is totally against your own sense of rationality, don't simply pronounce that as irrational. Try to understand a little bit more, and you may be able to transform yourself. Now, even though the Confucians assume, this is a big assumption, that all human beings share the same kind of feeling of commiseration. It's not possible to imagine a human being who is not capable of commiseration. Even a psychopath, potentially, there's that possibility. So the Confucians it's very interesting. The Confucians are very different from the French, especially the French deconstructionists. The French deconstructionists always try to find that which different. The difference is very important. The difference is where all the major issues need to be organized. The Confucians always try to find that which is shareable, that which is common. But I think you raise a very serious question. You may want to think, within this Confucian mode of thinking, how do you recognize radical difference? And even to consider radical difference as useful for your self-understanding. Now, you have a question here? Yeah. Anyone else? One more question, maybe. Don't feel shy. I am not.